So my whole entire childhood, my parents had still lived in the same house that I grew up in. And they had the same two neighbors the whole time that we grew up. On one side we had the Harpoles. It's kind of a weird name, but they had 4 kids that were a little bit older than my 2 sisters and I. But we played with them a little bit. We got along really well with the Harpoles. But the other side were the Bowers. And relationships were a little bit rough with the Bowers. And part of that was because of my sisters and I. So when I was like 4 or 5 years old, my sisters convinced me to go over to Mr. Bauer's house and to kick over the flowers in his little flower bed on the property line. And of course I was a good little brother, so I went and did whatever my sisters told me to do. And went over and kicked all the flowers down. I didn't know, like, sure, why not? A couple of years later, I accidentally ran a tractor through his fence in the backyard. That was a really expensive story, too. And then Mr. Bowers was a little bit particular on his property line. And when he thought that we were mowing a little too much on his side of the property, he began to put fence posts up between our yard and his. Not a fence, just like 4 random fence posts. And so a couple years later, when my oldest sister, who was the one that had the temper in our family, she started to drive, and she was backing out of our driveway, probably like 55 miles an hour or something like that, and clipped her driver's side mirror on one of the fence posts. And so she got mad and came out and just ripped them all up. And that was a bad move because my parents that night made me and my sisters take the fence post back to Mr. Bowers and set him on his front porch and knock on the door. And I remember I was probably about 11 or 12 years old, and I was mad because I was like, I didn't even do this, but I'll be here and apologize anyways. And Mr. Bowers gave us this long speech. And essentially he was saying that good fences make good neighbors. How many of you guys have heard that before? Good fences make good neighbors, yeah. It's a saying that's been around for a really long time. And essentially the idea is that if you have clear boundaries, you keep to yourself on one side, your neighbor keeps to themselves on the other, and you have proper boundaries, then everybody's happy. So good fences make good neighbors. And this saying has been around for a really long time. In fact, I tried to do some research and find out when it first popped up. And most people would trace it further back than this. But in 1914, the first time it was in writing was in a poem by Robert Frost called The Mending Wall. And Robert Frost wrote this poem about a farmer who is walking along his fence row with his neighbor, mending the fence together. And so they're picking up the stones from each side and putting it back on the fence. And as he's doing this, the farmer's neighbor keeps saying, good fences make good neighbors. Good fences make good neighbors. But the farmer has an epiphany thinking, well, why don't we just get to know each other and then we would be good neighbors. He says this in the poem. He says, before I built a wall, I'd ask to know what I was walling in or walling out, and to whom I was like to give offense. Essentially he's saying, would we be better neighbors if we just knew each other rather than putting up boundaries? And that's what we've talked about the past couple of weeks, the art of neighboring. How do we become better neighbors to the people that live around us? And then everybody got a book. If you didn't, there's some in the back. If this is your first time, we have a free book in the back for you on your way out. But basically, we want our church to be people that go out in the community and are good neighbors. And we've heard some great stories about this. Chris mentioned it in the video. Some of you guys are already starting to fill out some of the spaces in your magnet. This is just a little tool for you to actually fill out and write names and learn them. How many of you guys have filled out an extra spot this past week? Learn somebody else? All right, Bob, gold star for you. Good job. Yeah. If you haven't, we would love for you guys to take this magnet and really use it to get to know your neighbors. And something that Chris and I want to do is we want to resource you guys to actually be good neighbors. So as he mentioned, if you fill this out and send a picture of it to info@journeypoint.org, then you have the chance to win a Chick-fil-A catering party. So make sure you fill that out, send it in to us. I've already filled out 10 of these for it, so you guys got to step it up, all right? Right now I'm eating Chick-fil-A, all right? Also, we have 4 $50 gift cards to King Soopers. That if you want to do something in your neighborhood, we want to resource you for that. So if you want to do that, you can see me at the end of the service in the back. I have them in my pocket right now, and I'll give them to the first 4 people that ask for it. And we just ask that you use that to throw a block party, or invite the kids on your street over for a movie night, or just have neighbors over for dinner, and you can make a huge meal for them, if you're a good cook. But today, we're reading a story as we wrap up the series in Luke chapter 7. And in this story, a couple things are happening. First, we see that in the life of Jesus, he was constantly being invited to the best parties. So his first miracle, he's actually at a wedding reception and turns water into wine. And over again, you see that he gets invited to parties. Sometimes they're parties that religious leaders at the time thought that he shouldn't have been at. But as we pick up in Luke 7, verse 36, which is on page 916 in the Black Bibles if you want to follow along, a couple things are happening. Jesus is traveling around at this time, and he's doing some really great miracles. So at the beginning of the chapter, we see that a Roman leader comes up and finds Jesus and asks him to heal one of his servants that is sick. And the servant isn't with him. He's in a different city. And Jesus just speaks and heals his servant. And then you see Jesus is traveling along, and he comes across a funeral procession. And the funeral procession is a widow who is burying her last son. And so she essentially has no one else to take care of her. And Jesus has sympathy on the widow, so he raises her son back to life. And so all of these miracles that Jesus is doing at the beginning of Luke chapter 7, 2 crazy things are happening. One, he is developing a big following. People are starting to realize this guy's legit. We're going to follow him around and see what else he does. And 2, the second thing is that the religious leaders at the time, the Pharisees, are really starting to take note of Jesus and think like, okay, what is this guy doing? How is he doing it? And should we actually be following him? So that's what's happening as we pick up the story in Luke chapter 7. And one more thing I want to tell you, just a cultural reference for you to understand this story as we start reading it, is that Jesus gets invited to a Pharisee's home. And the Pharisee's name is Simon. He's a religious leader. And when people would invite him into their home for a meal, most likely they would eat on a courtyard or patio that was kind of outside the home, that was accessible by people from the street. And you also saw that they would recline at a table. And so when they reclined at a table, it looked a lot like this. The people that were invited to the meal would sit around the table on cushions and kind of lean with one arm or the other against the table, and their feet would be behind them. Okay, so it's not the traditional, like even the famous Lord's Supper painting that we see where they're sitting at a table like in chairs. That wasn't actually the cultural tradition at the time. This is more of what it would look like as we pick up the story. So follow along with me on verse 36 as we read the passage here. It says, then one of the Pharisees invited him to eat with him. He entered the Pharisee's house and reclined at the table. And a woman in the town who was a sinner found out that Jesus was reclining at the table in the Pharisee's house. She brought an alabaster jar of perfume and stood behind him at his feet, weeping, began to wash his feet with her tears. She wiped his feet with her hair, kissing them and anointing them with the perfume. So a couple things we see here real quick. Jesus is invited into this home of an important religious leader. And he's reclined at the table with other influential men of the community. And when it says that a woman who was a sinner came into the meal, basically it's a politically correct way to say that this woman was a prostitute. She was dressed like it, she wore hair like it, she acted like it in the city. Everybody at the table knew what her profession was. There was no hiding it. And she comes and, uninvited, into the meal, begins to wash Jesus' feet with her tears. So real quick, if you put yourself in the mindset of the Pharisee, Simon, the guy who invited Jesus into this meal, he's taken a little bit of heat from his colleagues, most likely, because some of the people that were other Pharisees really didn't like Jesus or what he was doing. They were actually out to destroy Jesus, to destroy his ministry, and eventually we see that they wanted to have him killed. But Simon was still thinking, okay, this guy is doing some miraculous things. He's legit. I want to get to know more about him. But as he sees this man, this important guy, Jesus, and Jesus is allowing this prostitute to touch him, he becomes skeptical that Jesus is really who he says he is. Pick up in verse 39. It says this: when the Pharisee, Simon, who had invited him, saw this, he said to himself, so he's thinking in his mind, this man, if he were a prophet, would know who and what kind of woman this is who's touching him. She's a sinner. Jesus replied to him, Simon, I have something to say to you. He said, say it, teacher. A creditor has two debtors. One owed 500 denarii and the other 50. Since they could not pay it back, he graciously forgave them both. So which of them will love him more? Simon answered, I suppose the one he forgave more. You have judged correctly, he told him. Turning to the woman, he said to Simon, do you see this woman? I entered your house, you gave me no water for my feet, but she with her tears has washed my feet and wiped them with her hair. You gave me no kiss, but she hasn't stopped kissing my feet since I came in. You didn't anoint my head with olive oil, but she has anointed my feet with perfume. Therefore I tell you, her many sins have been forgiven. That's why she loves so much. But the one who is forgiven little loves little. Then he said to her, your sins are forgiven. Now there's some irony in the story, because as Simon is thinking in his mind, this Jesus guy can't be a prophet. He doesn't really know. And as he's saying that, Jesus is reading his mind and starts to tell a story to kind of call him out on his thoughts. And so in this story, as we look at the art of neighboring, there's really three main things that I want to point out that each of the main characters in the story, Simon, Jesus, and the woman, can each teach us about being good neighbors. The first is this. From Jesus we see that we have to develop the art of receiving. And this is the idea that sometimes being a good neighbor means that we allow ourselves to be served. The art of neighboring is not always a one-way street. In fact, the book, The Art of Neighboring, says this: great neighborhoods are built on reciprocal relationships, on two-way streets. At the end of the day, no one wants to feel like a project. Have you guys ever had a relationship that was totally one-sided? When I was in ministry at another church in Kentucky, we had this one gentleman that started to come to our church, and he was really an outcast in the community. He had some legal trouble that really everybody kind of knew about. He was socially awkward. He had a little bit of a learning disability, and really he was one of those guys that was just very needy. And he developed a relationship with me, and he started to ask me a lot of favors. So he wanted to learn how to play guitar, and so me and him had some guitar lessons every once in a while. And then he would need a ride into town, and he would call me, and I would give him a ride into town. And eventually, he finally bought himself a truck, and there were multiple times where he would ask me to help him fill up his truck. And it was a one-sided relationship that honestly became super strained. It was one of those things where I dreaded seeing him on Sunday mornings at church. Or when I would see his name pop up on my phone, I was like, man, I don't know if I want to answer this right now. And it was hard, and maybe it was my fault for not allowing him into my life and letting him serve me. But we see that one-sided relationships a lot of times are difficult. They become strained, they're exhausting, and they're really discouraging. And that's what we see in the Art of Neighboring. It says that for there is a genuine sense of community among your neighbors, there must be a give and take. It has to be a two-way street. And neighboring is not just about you guys going out and doing charity work or serving your neighbors or always being the ones that are throwing block parties. Sometimes it's about you going out and being served. And in this passage, we see that Jesus receives this gift from the sinful woman humbly. He allows her to serve him and wash his feet. And she didn't have to do it to earn his forgiveness. In fact, if anything, in the passage we see that Simon should have been the one that washed Jesus' feet. It was the custom of the host to be the one that served his guest. But Jesus allowed a sinful woman to come in, and all she wanted to do was show her appreciation and honor to Jesus. And he allowed her to serve. And as we as we start to develop relationships with people on our street, with our actual neighbors, it's important for us to allow ourselves to be served. This may mean, you go and ask somebody to help you with a home improvement project, or knock on their door to borrow something. It means that we have to be humble, we have to be vulnerable, and admit where we're weak. But ultimately, allowing ourselves to receive and be served is just as important as us going out and serving our neighbors. The second thing we see in this passage is the art of accepting. Being a neighbor is sometimes messy, but we must accept our neighbors for who they are. So in the story, Simon invites some of his closest friends, right? You got to think these are other religious leaders in the community. He invites Jesus to come in, who's this up-and-coming religious leader who's got this great reputation right now. So he's having this party, he's got everything set up just perfect, and in walks a prostitute. Now, I can imagine that Simon, being a religious leader, probably wasn't trying to have that kind of party at his house, all right? So it was probably really awkward, embarrassing for him to have a prostitute walk in when he has all these other religious leaders in his home. And sometimes, like Simon, we judge people before we really get to know them. And that's what Simon did. He judged the woman before he really got to know who she was. And most of this is because we make assumptions based on the fact that we're scared. We live in a community or a society where we have 24-hour news coverage. Anytime something happens, our phones light up with alerts. And when we're bombarded by this bad news, naturally we become suspicious of everyone, right? I mean, think about your community Facebook page or your Nextdoor.com. How many times do you see posts of people thinking, like a picture of somebody, like, hey, does anybody know this guy? He looks suspicious. Or, in your neighborhood you have to drive at perfect speed, because if you drive too fast, they'll put a picture of you up. If you drive too slow, they'll put a picture of you up because you're creepy, right? So you have to have that perfect speed when you drive through the neighborhood. Just remember that. But as we are constantly suspicious of people, we're skeptical. Honestly, our society, we don't give anyone the benefit of the doubt. We're just naturally suspicious until they prove us wrong. And in verse 44, we see Jesus says this to Simon. He says, Simon, do you see this woman? Now, this is an interesting question, because the way that they were seated and reclined around the table, the only person that probably couldn't see her was Jesus. She was behind him. So obviously, yes, Simon could see her physically. But Jesus is saying, do you actually see this woman? Do you see her repentance? Do you see her vulnerability to come into this house uninvited just to serve me? Do you see her worship? And those were the things that Simon wasn't seeing. There's a fancy theological term for this called Imago Dei. And it basically means image of God. And this idea is that all humans, being the pinnacle of God's creation, were created in the image of God. So even if you don't believe in the creation story or Genesis, even if those are hard concepts for you to wrap your mind around, everybody understands that humans are set apart in the animal kingdom. There's things about us that are different. You think about it, that we have unique speech patterns. There's complex in the way that we communicate with each other that nobody else has. There's a ability to reason and think logically. The ability to have emotions, to have fear, to have anger, to have embarrassment. We're the only animal that blushes when we get embarrassed. All of these things point out that there's something special about humans. There's something in us that sets us apart from everybody else. And the Bible teaches us that the thing that sets us apart is that we're actually created in the image of God. And we see that being created in the image of God gives us an intrinsic worth. That's in the Bible, it teaches us that the reason that we love and honor each other is because ultimately we're all created in the image of God. This also teaches us that we're relational beings. We have the ability to have relationships with people and relationships with God. And it's funny because if you think back 2 weeks ago, we talked about the greatest commandment in Luke chapter 10. And the greatest commandment is to love God and love your neighbor as yourself. And those two things happen because we're created in the image of God. And in fact, those two commands are actually intertwined. Because you can't truly love God if you're not loving your neighbors. And by loving your neighbors, you're actually loving God. And all of that is because we're all created in the image of God. And that's super deep, and it makes my head spin to think about it and explain it. But ultimately, the art of neighboring is accepting our neighbors for who they are, because they are created in the image of God. And because they are just as worthy as you or I. And this means that sometimes you're going to find yourself in messy situations. Like being a good neighbor means that you might go to the party that you wouldn't necessarily go to. Or you might hang out with people that you think you have nothing in common with. And those relationships are messy, they're hard. And people honestly can be weird to us. Like every street has somebody weird on it. If you just think down through your street, go ahead and think about it. You nail the person, right? If you can't, then it's probably you, right? So if you're thinking, oh, everybody's normal, then yeah, that's a sign. But to be a good neighbor means that we master the art of accepting people and loving them because they were created in the image of God. But finally from this story, we see that the simple woman teaches us the art of loving unconditionally. Sometimes this is a hard thing because when churches start to promote neighboring, or when we do community service projects like Pass It On, a lot of people on the outside question our motives. They think that you guys are only doing this because you want me to come to your church. Or you're only doing this because you want to convert me to Christianity. So the question is why we're doing things. And those are good questions because honestly, part of them are true. Do we want you to invite your neighbors to Journey Point? Absolutely. Do we want you to tell people how God is working in your life or how He's changed your life in the past? Absolutely. But we want those things to come naturally. We don't want you to force it on them. And honestly, if they're not receptive to it, we don't want you to just shut down that relationship and move on. The thing we want is for you to be a good neighbor because that's what Jesus tells us to do. Not to try to win them over for anything. There's really no motive behind it other than because we're called to love our neighbors. The Art of Neighboring book says this: we don't love our neighbors so that they will know Jesus. We love our neighbors because we already love Jesus. And we don't want you to be good neighbors in order to bring them here to church. We want you to be a good neighbor because that's what Jesus called us to do. And if you're in the room and you're not sure about the whole God and Jesus saying, and you're just trying to figure it out, you can still be a good neighbor. But ultimately, we believe that a relationship with Jesus allows you to better love and serve your neighbors. So the woman in the story enters into this party uninvited. She begins to wash Jesus' feet with her tears. Now, if you think about it in this context, everybody wore open sandals, and they walked everywhere. So I'm sure that his feet were not the cleanest feet that you or I can imagine. And she is literally using her tears. She's crying so much that she can wash his feet with her tears. And then she wipes them clean with her hair. And it shows that she takes an alabaster jar of perfume, which the fact that it's in an alabaster jar proves that it was very expensive. It begins to anoint his feet. She showed a tremendous act of love, mostly because she understood her sin. She understood how much Jesus could forgive her. And that's what Jesus says in the parable. He says, people that are forgiven more will ultimately love more. And it's not about the fact that, I haven't sinned very much, so I'm not forgiven very much, so I can't love very much. It's not about that. It's about us recognizing that we all fall short. That none of us are actually good in God's eyes. We all have brokenness. We all have a mess to clean up. And knowing that we've been forgiven by God allows us to love unconditionally. If we're all honest, we have a past, a story that we might not be proud to share. There's an aspect of brokenness in all of our lives. And understanding our own failures puts our relationship in a better context with each other. The perspective is better because are your neighbors' lives messy? Yeah, absolutely. Are they hard to love sometimes? Yes. But so are you. So am I. My life is messy. I'm hard to love. And ultimately, as we understand our brokenness, we have a greater appreciation for the forgiveness that Jesus gives, and a greater desire to love and live the way He commands us. Recognizing this brokenness is understanding that we can't do life on our own. And this is where Jesus comes in, because God sent Jesus to live a sinless life, so that ultimately He could take our place, die on the cross for our sins, and defeat death through His resurrection. And the forgiveness that He offers the woman in the story is the same forgiveness that He offers you and I today. And all He asks is that we step up, make Him king of our life, and live according to His commands. So good neighbors aren't made up by good fences. That's a myth. It's a saying that we all say to just put up boundaries and protect ourselves. Good neighbors are made when we learn to receive gifts humbly. They learn we're good neighbors when we accept people for who they are. And we're good neighbors whenever we love unconditionally, because we understand the forgiveness that Jesus gave us. As I was reading this book this past week, there was one quote that really stood out to me. It was really convicting. It says this: "In this life, we can only do a few things really well. I think it's a good idea to make certain one of these things is what Jesus says is most important. That we love God and that we love our neighbors as ourselves."